what people often think is that Africans got to Europe by means of slavery. That is what I want to clarify, that it is not true. That is not the case. If we say that Alessandro mother was got to Europe as a slave, okay, let me even take it from that. Let's even take that is the case. Now, let me ask you like this. Like Alessandro, is there any other person that you have found within a similar situation, maybe in another part of Italy or in Europe, that we might say is not as a process of slavery? I'm trying to see if there is any way that we have had a kind of relationship apart from being slave to another. That is what I'm trying to clarify.
I mean, I think that certainly the research that I personally have done does not sort of do a big examination of the slave trade between West Africa, as it is by this point, and Europe. But so far as I understand it, the majority, there are some free black people in Italy, some people of African descent. But the majority arrive there through some connection with the slave trade. Now, sometimes, not absolutely necessarily, there are people who come as, for example, expert musicians, expert dancers, so even with them, however, it's often the roots of migration are connected with slavery, and it's difficult to be clear with any given individual whether or not they are a slave. It's quite hard from the records. But I think there is not, at this point, a lot of free African migration to Italy. I just don't particularly think that's the case. I know there's a kind of, I can very much understand the sort of desire to try to be clear and very clear about the fact that all African history in this period related to Europe is not about slavery. And I think the point where you see that Alessandro actually seems to me to be somebody who is more likely to have a connection through slavery. If you want people who are not connected through slavery, there are certainly examples. So a lot of the examples on that front, however, come from are in relation to Ethiopia, and they're examples of people whose connections are through the church. Because of Ethiopia being the Christian part of Africa at this point, you get, for example, a whole monastery in Rome, the monastery of Santo Stefano degli Abissini, which is a monastery of African monks. In Rome, near the Vatican, still exists. So you get that kind of migration, not engaged with the slave trade. That's a kind of separate thing. You get ambassadors who come from Ethiopia. You get a kind of exchange of diplomatic relations between Ethiopia and the papacy. So I think it partly depends, again, on which part of Africa you're talking about the extent to which relations with and migration into Italy are likely to be connected to slavery or not, because it seems to me that the bit where you get a lot of free relations is in relationship to Christian East Africa, and the bit where relations are more likely to have to do with slave trading are to do with West Africa. So it's not absolutely straightforward, but I think I would tend to think about there being more than one route of engagement and international relations, and those are somewhat geographically connected.
That would be interesting. I would love to also have that view here. The point is that I don't like ignorance, because I think we have the possibility of knowing. We have the possibility of able to explore and understand. I think that is also the work that people like you, historians, are doing and should do more, giving a kind of a clear balance of situations. No, because look at it. Europe and Africa is separated by a small stretch of water. So to tell me that we are just knowing ourselves for the first time, oh, come on, I'm not a baby, we're not going to take that.
Oh, no.
Also,
I think there's lots of, I think there's not, but I think the interesting thing there is obviously, over millennia, there is migration into, across that strip of water in the Mediterranean. And of course, like through the Roman Empire, I mean, there are lots and lots and lots of Romans. Obviously, the Roman Empire colonizes and then kind of invites into citizenship a lot of people from all along the north coast of Africa. So there's a whole history of very, very long-term migration and population mixing that goes on there. And I think that's also a big part of this story. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not the case that there's a sudden change, but I think there is some distinction between. I mean, you get documents like this rather terrible document from the Marchioness of Mantua, Isabella d'Este, very, very famous Renaissance woman and collector, who sends a note to her agent in Venice saying, well, I want you to find me a little slave girl who is as black as possible. And so it seems to me that there is, amongst the aristocracy of Italy at this time, there is a certain amount of fetishization around skin color of African servants, that is slightly different from the way that you might encounter African migrants to Italy who had kind of come of their own accord and settled into villages in the south and just got on with their lives. So I think there's a kind of particular treatment there that it seems to me is like a little bit different in terms of its quite unpleasant quality that really did happen and sort of which we ought to be kind of conscious.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Surely there are many of those stories around. There is no argument about that. That is true. But what I'm saying is that a lot of Africans and Europeans have engagement that was not based on slavery. So when we talk about the interaction between African and European, I don't think we should limit it to slavery just for the sake of helping us to diminish the image of Africans in relation with the Europeans. Because when you were making mention of the fact that race, as when other historians probably are citing the case of Alessandro de Medici, they usually make mention of race, make mention of the fact that it's coming from African or using N-word to sort of degrade his importance as a ruler. That is part of the narration of saying that there is nothing else between Africa that connects Africa to Europe other than slavery. That is what I'm actually saying. That's why I'm saying that it is not true. Africa and Europe are too close to have just been meeting only at the point of at the transatlantic slave trade, for example. In the city where I live, the patron saint is called San Zeno. It's also from Africa. So maybe that also we can. If that is if the narration is that the Africa get to Europe through slavery, then that also is a slave, So I think we need to clarify that. We need to really be very clear on that we have a lot of relationships that are not based on slavery.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And I think the more research there is, particularly into the links of multiple early church thinkers. I mean, for most obviously, I guess, St. Augustine of Hippo, North African background. There's a whole world of that early Christian engagement across Mediterranean, which is very, very important to development of the church. We have all those links that continue. There's a whole set of relationships between Europe and Africa, which are to do with trade, which are to do with, to say, the examples of military service. There are all sorts of stories that we can tell that are not about just saying, well, it's from the 15th century and it starts with Portuguese colonization and building forts and so on. And that is, I think, an important story. But as you said, I think you're absolutely right. It's not the only one. And if, as you go back into the medieval period, back to the later Roman Empire, there are a whole load of ways that one can talk about the history of African and European interactions that are not about slavery, or that sit alongside a slave system. In the case of the Roman Empire, where slavery is not defined on an ethnic basis. Roman slave. I mean, all sorts of people can be enslaved in the Roman system, and that is not something that maps onto skin color as it comes to do later on in the 16th and the 17th centuries. So yeah, I think absolutely this is a story that needs to be broken down, needs to be thought about differently. And within that, I mean, Alessandro is somebody who, perhaps has that background. Certainly the sources tend to point in the direction of an association with slavery in his mother's case, but then, manages to, thanks to his father's family connections, rise to be ruler of a major Italian city-state. I mean, that's a very different sort of story from perhaps the one that we expect about slavery and victimhood. And for that reason alone, I think it's an important story to tell.